Hello again, folks. Dr. Yates with you once again as we continue discussing the Hebrew Bible. Just some foundational ideas to frame our discussion and to help you with the reading passages and the lectures. What I want to focus on this time, and I deliberately separated it from our discussion of biblical scholarship terms, because it's so important that I felt that I needed to address it and present it to you separately. But this is an important term when we discuss biblical or the Bible, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and it's a very significant term in biblical scholarship altogether. Okay, that term is the documentary hypothesis. Now, I'm going to just give you the basics of it. I'm not going to try to go into every little nuance and area of discussion. I just want to give you a basic idea of what it is when we refer to it. But it does pertain to the Hebrew Bible centrally. All right? So here we go. The documentary hypothesis. It's one of several models that biblical scholars have historically used to explain the origins of the Hebrew Bible, especially the Torah, and the composition of the Torah. Now, the Torah is essentially the first 5 books of the Protestant Old Testament. It's also called the Pentateuch. Okay, Penta means 5. Okay, so the Torah is the Hebrew term. Pentateuch is the Greek term, but we're talking about the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those 5 books. That's the Torah. That's the Pentateuch. So this documentary hypothesis is applied to those 5 books because they're technically the 5 most important and most foundational books of the Hebrew Bible. So, biblical scholars in general agree, and that doesn't always happen, but they agree that the Torah, these 5 books, the Torah is not a unified work from a single author. I mean, I think we can say that's pretty much a fact. Tradition says that these 5 books were written by Moses. And so they've often been called the books of Moses. But close scholarly research and interpretation, study, etc., basically says, or now says to us that it wasn't the work of one single person or one single author. Instead, the Torah is made up of sources that have been combined over a huge number of centuries by many, many, many different hands. Okay? So, tradition's one thing. And I understand tradition, and tradition has a way of simplifying things for folks and assuring people of some things. But when you're looking from a scholarly lens, the single author tradition just does not hold water. Okay, I'm not saying it's wrong necessarily. I understand why people want to believe it. But I'm saying not whether it's right or wrong, but that it's more complex And because it's more complex, there are many more considerations to take in than tradition typically tries to answer. I hope that makes sense. Okay. So the documentary hypothesis is this. It puts forth the idea, and again, it is a hypothesis. It's just an accepted hypothesis, that the Pentateuch, the Torah, is a compilation, a compiling of 4 originally independent documents, 4 original separate documents, and have now been put together in this compilation that we call the Pentateuch. Okay. These 4 documents are the Yavist, or Yavist, which we typically designate by the capital letter J, the Elohist, capital letter E, the Deuteronomist, capital letter D, and priestly, capital letter P. These are all sources for the Pentateuch. Okay, the Yavist source, the Elohist source, the Deuteronomist source, and the priestly source. So keep those letters in mind, J, E, D, and P, because that's what the documentary hypothesis is basically grounded upon. So here's a diagram, and it can be kind of daunting and complicated, but basically the documentary hypothesis is that the Yavist source and the Elohist source ultimately were separate, and then over time were combined together. And then the priestly source was separate, but again, over time, it was gradually made a part of the Yavist and Elohist. Okay. Then we have the Deuteronomic sources, which is basically one Deuteronomy source and a second Deuteronomy source, and then aspects of Deuteronomic history. Those were all developed separately and then brought together in this one source called the Deuteronomic source. Okay, so I hope you can see that in the diagram. Then the J and E, along with the P source, were combined into the Torah with the Deuteronomic source. Okay. Excuse me. So the Deuteronomic source includes most of what we've come to accept as the book of Deuteronomy. And the priestly source comes to include most of what we accept as the book of Leviticus. Okay. So ultimately, Deuteronomic history tends to have an impact. And when we're talking about Deuteronomic history, we're talking about the later books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. Okay. But the Yavist, the Elohist were combined, then they were combined with the priestly, then Deuteronomic grew out of Deuteronomy 1, Deuteronomy 2, and Deuteronomic history. That particular source of Deuteronomy then joined with the Yavist and Elohist, the priestly into the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. That's the documentary hypothesis. Now, the first of these sources, J for the Yahvist, basically dates to what we call, in terms of Hebrew history, the Solomonic period. This is basically around 950 BCE. In other words, 950 years before the Common Era. So, about 1,000 years BC. Okay. The Elohist has been dated essentially later, and it's in the 9th century BCE. Okay, it came after the Yahvist. The Yahvist is the oldest at 950 BC. Next came the Elohist. Then the Deuteronomic was dated right before the reign of King Josiah in Hebrew history. And this was in the 7th, possibly 8th century BCE. And then the priestly source has basically been dated to the time of Ezra, which was around the 5th century BCE. Okay. So what that basically says is that the oldest source, the Yahvist, is around 950, roughly 1,000 years BCE. And it was around for at least probably 100 years or so before the Elohist source. And the Deuteronomic source didn't come around or develop until 1 to 200 more years, 1 to 2 centuries after the Yahvist and the Elohist. And finally, the priestly source didn't appear or wasn't written down or wasn't developed until the 5th century, which is 500 years after the Yahvist source. Okay. And this is a perfect example of what I mentioned last time about redaction. The sources across this span of time, across these 500 years, were basically joined together at different points in their history by a series of redactors. In other words, a series of editors who put them together, and not one single author. Okay, that's the documentary hypothesis, and it works for me. I can really see how this fits in and explains how these books came to be written and copied and assembled and compiled into what we call the Torah, the Pentateuch, or as we tend to accept it, the books of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Okay, I hope this helps some. I hope this gives you something to think about. We'll see you next time. Go forth and prosper.